What if the justice you believed to be fair was actually a game of power, manipulation, and lies? What if a single man's decision could completely destroy an innocent person's life just to protect a dark secret? Imagine waking up one day, living your routine like any other ordinary person, and suddenly seeing your life ripped away from you without explanation. His name printed in the newspapers like a monster. His face being shown on TV like a cold, calculating criminal. And the worst? You scream for your innocence, but no one is willing to listen. The truth no longer matters. You have already been convicted before the trial even begins. That's exactly what happened to Leonardo Martins, a simple, hard-working man with dreams, family, plans for the future. But all of that disappeared in a matter of days. A young girl murdered, a poorly done investigation, a society hungry for justice, and a judge who had already decided the verdict before any evidence was even presented. But why? What would make a judge convict an innocent person without blinking? What was being hidden behind that courtroom? Leonardo didn't know. The world didn't know. But the truth, the truth was there all along, right before our eyes, buried beneath layers of lies and vested interests. The media turned Leonardo into a villain, a soulless psychopath. TV programs debated his dangerous personality. Psychologists analyzed his gestures. Headlines featured his name alongside words such as murderer, monster, cold and calculating. But no one wanted to look beyond the surface. No one questioned the flimsy evidence, the inconsistent testimony, the glaring holes in the case. Because for society, the truth no longer mattered, just the show. And the show needed someone to blame. Now imagine what was going on in Leonardo's head as he heard the judge's gavel banging, as the words guilty echoed through the courtroom, sealing his fate, while the world applauded his conviction, without even suspecting that they were sending an innocent man to hell. But what no one knew, what no one could ever imagine, was that that judge had a much greater reason to guarantee this conviction, something that, if it came to light, would destroy not only his career, but his entire life. Because the real culprit was closer than anyone could imagine. And that's when the story starts to take a turn that no one expected. The question is, how many innocent people are still imprisoned because someone powerful decided to hide the truth? And most importantly, could Leonardo survive long enough for this truth to be revealed? If this story made you think, if at any point you felt outraged or indignant, then you know what to do. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel so that more people know about this reality. How many innocent people are still paying for crimes they never committed? Together, we can bring these stories to light and stop injustices like this from continuing to happen. Leonardo Martins never imagined that his life, built with so much effort and dedication, could be ripped away from him in an instant. He was an ordinary, hard-working man, someone who always believed in justice and the value of honesty. A family man dedicated to his work and his children, he led a simple life, without imagining that one day his name would make headlines in the newspapers as the main suspect in a crime he never committed. But on that fateful night, everything changed. A young woman was brutally murdered in a dark alley, and without any concrete evidence, the police decided that Leonardo was the perfect culprit. Public fear, media pressure, and the need to find someone responsible quickly turned a rushed investigation into an endless nightmare. Leonardo became a target before he even understood what was happening. He was taken from his home in the middle of the night, handcuffed in front of his children, without even having the chance to defend himself. The neighbors, who had previously greeted him with respect, now whispered behind his back. The look of compassion he expected from the police never came. On the contrary, from the first moment, he realized that no one was interested in the truth. The detectives had already made their choice, and he was the ideal culprit. An ordinary man, without influence, without power. Someone no one would mind forgetting behind bars. At the police station, The interrogations were brutal. Questions full of accusations, looks of contempt, cruel insinuations. Leonardo screamed his innocence, begged them to seek the truth, but no one wanted to listen. His despair was treated as coldness, your unbelief, like guilt. Didn't he cry in front of the cameras? Then he must be a psychopath. Couldn't he explain where he was every minute of that night? So he was a cold and calculating killer. The story was already written before the trial even began, and the only thing missing was the sentence. The city had never seen such a brutal crime. The young woman's body was found in a dirty alley, lit only by the dim glow of streetlights. Blood ran down the asphalt, creating a scene that looked like something out of a horror movie. The news spread like wildfire. Fear took over the streets. Newspapers printed alarming headlines. The news showed shocking images, and experts gave interviews debating the growing violence. The population demanded justice. The pressure was unbearable. The police needed someone to blame, and at that moment, it didn't matter who it was, as long as someone paid for the crime. Leonardo Martins didn't even know that his life was about to be crushed by this storm. While the chaos unfolded outside, he continued his routine, without imagining that his name was already being dragged into the center of this tragedy. All it took was one irrelevant detail to turn an ordinary man into the perfect villain. A misunderstanding, a witness who saw him walk down the street on the wrong night, a minimal connection that in any other circumstance would have been dismissed as coincidence. But under pressure from the media and society, this was enough to convict him even before the trial. The newspapers wasted no time. Leonardo was turned into a headline. Television programs explored every detail of his life, distorting facts, building an irresistible narrative to maintain the audience. Photos of him were plastered across the screen as commentators described his suspicious behavior. Why doesn't he seem desperate? They asked. Could this cold man be hiding something? The population did not need proof. I needed someone to blame, to hate. And Leonardo, without even understanding what was happening, was already the monster of the moment. The investigation was conducted in a hasty, negligent, almost criminal manner. Important details were ignored. Clues that could lead to the real killer were never followed up. None of that mattered. For the police officers in charge of the case, each new piece of evidence was distorted to fit the story they had already decided to tell. Questions that should have been asked never were. Witnesses who could deny the accusation were not heard. Leonardo was not a suspect being investigated. He was a culprit waiting to be officially convicted. Meanwhile, the real killer was still out there, free, watching everything from afar, knowing that someone innocent was being crushed in his place, knowing that justice didn't want to find him. He just wanted to close the case and move on. And Leonardo, surrounded by cameras, headlines, and people pointing fingers at him, felt his world falling apart without even having the chance to defend himself. While Leonardo was dragged into the eye of the storm, the real culprit walked freely through the streets, without fear, without remorse, without any concern that justice might reach him. He knew he was protected, always has been. His name was Enrique Vasconcelos, the only son of Judge Antonio Vasconcelos, an influential man, respected and feared within the court. Henry wasn't just a troubled young man. He was a sociopath masquerading as a promising heir. He grew up surrounded by privilege, escaping unscathed from problems that would ruin anyone else. Petty crimes, bar fights, harassment accusations hushed up with silent agreements. The law never caught up with him. Your father always found a way, always. On the night of the crime, Enrique was there. He was seen, but no one dared say his name. He stumbled out of a bar, laughing loudly, accompanied by friends as arrogant as he was. He followed the same dark street where, minutes later, that young woman would have her life brutally snatched from her. But instead of investigating him, the police officers looked away. One of them even commented to a colleague, "It's better not to mess with that one. It will give you a headache." And then, as if his presence in that scene were invisible, Henrique simply disappeared from the records. His connection to the crime was erased before it was even questioned. When the first suspicions fell on him, a phone call changed everything. Judge Antonio Vasconcelos received information that his son had been mentioned in one of the statements. In less than an hour, this statement disappeared from the records. The police officer who dared to mention it was transferred to another police station, and the evidence that could lead to Henry was buried so deep that no one would ever find it. The judge could not allow his only son to tarnish the family name. He could not allow Henry's promising future to be destroyed by a youthful mistake. He could not and would not let justice take its course. The solution was quick, efficient, and ruthless. Find a scapegoat, someone with no power, no connections, someone no one would defend. And Leonardo, an ordinary man with no prior record, no money to pay for powerful lawyers, was the perfect victim. The judge used his influence to ensure the case followed the right path, the path that would land Leonardo behind bars. He manipulated evidence, directed the prosecution, influenced the jury, and, above all, made sure no one questioned what was happening. While Leonardo tried to understand why his life was being destroyed, Henrique watched everything from afar, safe, untouchable. He knew his father would guarantee his freedom, as he always did. The system that was supposed to seek the truth had already chosen its narrative. And the greatest irony was that no one, absolutely no one, seemed willing to challenge this lie. Leonardo's trial was not just a miscarriage of justice. It was a spectacle meticulously engineered to ensure the truth never came to light. The court was packed on the day of the hearing. The media treated the case like a show, printing sensationalist headlines and distorted narratives. The public had already been conditioned to see him as a monster. Before he even stepped foot in court, he was already condemned in the eyes of society. But the real condemnation did not happen there. It was planned behind the scenes, where the scales of justice had already been corrupted before the first statement was even given. From the beginning, Leonardo's defense was silenced. His lawyer, an overworked and under-influenced public defender, could barely make his arguments before he was interrupted by the prosecution, who was working as an extension of the prosecution. Witnesses who could prove Leonardo's innocence were mysteriously discredited. A neighbor who claimed to have seen a man in a hoodie coming out of the alley that night was deemed confused and unreliable. The bar waiter, who clearly remembered Henrique Vasconcelos leaving altered minutes before the crime, gave up testifying after receiving unexpected visits from the police. Even a security camera that could have captured the real culprit was found to be out of order that night. But the worst blow came from the so-called irrefutable evidence. The prosecutor, with a confident and theatrical tone, presented the jury with a bloody knife found meters from the crime scene. What no one knew was that the blood had never been tested to confirm who it belonged to. It didn't matter. The simple fact that there was a weapon pointed like the one used in the crime was enough to seal Leonardo's fate. He watched helplessly as his life crumbled before his eyes. And when he tried to speak, when he dared to say he was innocent, the judge banged the gavel and ordered him to shut up. The same judge who was supposed to guarantee a fair trial was the architect of the greatest injustice of his life. Every word said in that court was already part of a rehearsed script. Every look exchanged between the prosecutors and the judge was a silent confirmation that everything was going according to plan. The truth was buried, replaced by a story that made sense to public opinion, that served the interests of those who really held power. And when the verdict was read, Leonardo didn't just feel the weight of the conviction, he felt the weight of a cruel reality. He never had a chance. The system never wanted justice. The system wanted someone to blame. And now he was that culprit. Imagine spending years of your life screaming for justice and no one listening. Imagine seeing your history distorted, your name destroyed, and your freedom stripped away with no chance of defense. Leonardo never had a voice, but now he has you. If this story made you outraged, if it made you reflect on how many innocent people are still unjustly imprisoned, I want you to write in the comments, "Justice failed." I want to know your opinion. Do you think the judge should pay for this crime? What would you do if you were Leonardo? Tell me below, because your voice matters more than ever. The iron gate closed behind Leonardo with a dry bang, as if sealing his fate forever. The smell of mold and despair permeated the air. The cold, worn walls seemed to absorb the screams of those who, like him, were forgotten by the world. The trial was already over, but the real sentence had just begun. On the first day, he realized that his punishment went beyond bars and chains. Cutting glances, threatening whispers in the corridors, inmates who saw him not as a wronged innocent, but as a cruel murderer, the worst kind. A man who, according to the media, killed a defenseless young woman. No explanation would change that. No words would be enough to convince them otherwise. The first attack came without warning. As he picked up his tray from the cafeteria, a violent punch hit his stomach, causing him to fall to his knees. Laughter echoed around him. "Monster," someone muttered before they kicked him in the face. The metallic taste of blood filled his mouth, but Leonardo didn't fight back. He knew it would be no use. In the cell at night, he felt fear crawl over his skin. I knew I was alone. No allies. With no one to protect your life. The guards ignored the threats and deep down even encouraged them. To them, he was just another criminal getting what he deserved. The days dragged on as if time were an additional punishment. The worst part was not the physical violence, but the weight of loneliness, the absence of letters, of visits, of any proof that the outside world still remembered that it existed. He would talk to the walls, stare at the ceiling for hours, searching for a shred of hope that could keep him sane. But hope was treacherous. It faded with each passing day. The silence in the cell did not bring peace. It only amplified the echo of the injustice that condemned him. And then came the doubt. If everyone said he was guilty, if no one questioned it, had he somehow become what he feared so much? Were the system, the media, and the people around them right? But even in his darkest moments, Leonardo clung to what was left of his dignity. He would not allow them to break him. Every day he repeated to himself, "I am innocent, the truth exists. Someone, somewhere will find out." But how long can a man hold out before losing faith? How many years can a human being endure being treated as something they never were? Leonardo didn't know, but he felt he was reaching his limit. What he didn't imagine was that, outside, a small crack was beginning to form in the wall of lies that kept him trapped. Something was about to change, and this change would come from where he least expected it. The years passed like a dense, endless fog for Leonardo. Inside the cold cell, he could no longer tell if it was day or night. His existence had become a repetitive cycle of suffering and silence. But outside, a spark of change was beginning to burn. In a small, disorganized office filled with dusty files, a veteran investigator, Daniel Vasquez, leafed through old cold case records. He had spent his life trying to correct errors in the system. He knew that justice was often not fair, and Leonardo Martins was a name he had heard before. A closed case, a perfect trial, evidence that seemed to fit together too well, but something didn't make sense. Vasquez read every detail of the case, and the deeper he delved, the more his intuition screamed that something was wrong. The rush to condemn, the absence of concrete evidence, witnesses who appeared suddenly and were never seen again. But then something caught his attention. The prosecution's main witness, a waitress who swore she had seen Leonardo near the alley on the night of the crime, had disappeared months after the trial. No records, no clues as to his whereabouts. How could someone so crucial to the conviction disappear without a trace? Deciding to find answers, he tracked down the woman's old colleagues and after weeks found a name. She was still alive. When he finally tracked her down, the truth came as a brutal blow. In a low, trembling voice, she confessed that she had lied in court, that I had never seen Leonardo that night, that she was coerced by detectives, pressured to sign a false statement under the threat of being accused of obstruction. I was terrified, she whispered. I just wanted it to be over. Vasquez's heart quickened. If the main witness lied, then the entire basis of the accusation against Leonardo would collapse. But there was still more. Vasquez went further, re-examining the forensic reports, and it was then that he found what seemed impossible. The DNA samples collected at the crime scene had never been cross-referenced with a modern database. When he got permission for a new test, the revelation was devastating. The blood found at the scene did not belong to the victim, much less to Leonardo. It belonged to another man, a man whose name had never been mentioned in court. Upon reviewing the information, Vasquez felt a shiver run down his spine. The name belonged to someone who should never have been linked to the case. Someone protected, someone who had never even been investigated. The connection was clear, and now he knew he was about to unearth a secret that should never have come to light. Leonardo was innocent, but the truth that could set him free was the same truth that would put Vasquez in danger. Because on the other side of this investigation, there was a power much greater than he imagined. Vasquez knew he was dealing with something big, but even he didn't realize the size of the abyss he was about to face. When he gained access to the updated DNA report and confirmed that Leonardo Martins had been convicted without any concrete evidence, he realized that the only way to achieve justice was to bring this truth to light. But fighting a system that had already buried the truth once meant taking risks. He would need the media. It would need public opinion. He would need to turn a forgotten case into a scandal impossible to ignore. It was then that he approached an investigative journalist known for exposing miscarriages of justice, someone who wasn't afraid to challenge the system. When he presented the documents, the manipulated statements, the ignored evidence, and most importantly, the revelation that the blood at the crime scene belonged to someone else, someone who had never been investigated, the reporter knew that this was the story of his life. Within a few days, the article was published. Explosive headlines appeared everywhere. The man convicted without evidence, coerced witnesses, hidden evidence. The commotion was immediate. TV programs debated the case. Legal commentators questioned how such a weak trial had sent an innocent man to prison for so many years. But with the truth beginning to emerge, the other side also moved. The judge who sentenced Leonardo tried to discredit the investigation, calling it a desperate attempt to rewrite a closed case. He tried to use his influence to stop the documents from reaching the Supreme Court. He tried to silence the new witnesses, but it was already too late. The public was outraged. Protests began outside the courthouse, signs held up with words like "Free Leonardo," "Justice failed," "Who's protecting the real culprit?" The pressure became unbearable. The system that once thoughtlessly condemned Leonardo now found itself forced to reopen the case, not because it wanted justice, but because it could no longer contain the scandal. The world now knew. What was once a secret, kept in the dark corridors of corrupt justice, now echoed far and wide. But there were still unanswered questions. Who exactly were they protecting? Why was the real culprit never investigated? And how far was the judge willing to go to prevent the truth from finally coming out? Now I need to know what you think. After all this, after years of absurd injustice, do you think just reopening the case is enough? Should someone who destroyed an innocent person's life just move on without paying for it? If you believe the truth needs to come out whatever it takes, comment "real justice" and tag someone who needs to know this story. The truth needs to be spread. The courtroom was packed, but the silence was deafening. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of decades of lies and injustice. The judge, once a symbol of integrity, now sat in front of everyone, his face pale, his eyes fixed on nothingness, as if he knew there was no way out. For years he kept the truth buried, manipulating evidence, distorting testimony, and convicting an innocent man to protect his own son. But now, the cracks in his charade had turned into an irreparable chasm. The room erupted in murmurs as the documents were presented. Pages upon pages of hidden records, doctored files, witnesses who had been coerced into silence. The truth could no longer be ignored. Leonardo Martins was a scapegoat. The real killer, the judge's son, was never in danger because justice was bought and corrupted from day one. The Achado's shocking revelation came as a blunt blow. In the midst of the chaos, a voice echoed, cutting through the tension like a sharp blade. I killed. I was protected, and an innocent man paid for my crime. The real culprit, the judge's son, finally broke his silence. His face, once untouchable, now showed regret, or perhaps just the fear of finally facing the truth. Cameras recorded every second. The world watched in real time the collapse of an empire of lies. The public, who had for so long believed the official narrative, now watched in astonishment as the house of cards collapsed. Shouts of indignation began to spread throughout the room. Justice for Leonardo! This judge has to pay for what he did! The voices rose. The anger grew like an uncontrollable fire. The system that was supposed to protect the innocent had cruelly and deliberately failed. But the big question still hung in the air. Would it be possible to correct such a big mistake? After so many years, Leonardo watched everything without reacting. He always knew he was innocent. He always believed that one day the truth would come out. But now, seeing the man who destroyed his life unmasked, the taste of justice seemed bitter. 40 years of pain, humiliation, and despair. He would never get his youth back. He would never recover the lost hugs, the stolen moments, the life that should have been his. And in the midst of the cry for justice, the question that no one dared to answer echoed in his mind. How many others were living this same nightmare? How many innocent people were still behind bars because someone powerful decided to hide the truth? The prison gates slowly opened, and for the first time in 40 years, Leonardo felt the cold wind of freedom touch his face. But it didn't seem real. He didn't celebrate, he didn't smile, he didn't cry. The world he knew was long gone. The buildings were different, the streets were busier, the people were further away. He left with no bags, no family waiting, no place to go. For 4 decades, he lived like a ghost inside a cell, and now, on the outside, he remained just that, a man with no past, no present, and no future. The media, the same ones that turned him into a monster, now wanted his testimony. Reporters surrounded him, cameras pointed at his weather-beaten face, microphones being shoved into him. How does it feel to be cleared? What would you say to the judge who destroyed your life? Would you forgive the system that buried you alive? But how does one respond to this? How can you put into words the pain of seeing your youth ripped away? How can he explain the emptiness of knowing that everyone he once loved went on with their lives without him? Leonardo just kept walking, letting the questions get lost in the chaos around him. The scandal took over the country. People revolted, marched in the streets, demanding changes in the judicial system. It was unacceptable that an innocent man had rotted behind bars while the real criminal lived his life normally. The judge tried to defend himself, tried to claim that he acted under pressure, that he believed in Leonardo's guilt, but the evidence against him was overwhelming. He didn't just rig a trial, he destroyed lives. Society wanted justice. It wanted to see the judge pay for what he did. But there was an even bigger question hanging in the air. Who could give Leonardo back lost time? Who would make up for the stolen opportunities, the destroyed dreams, the moments that could never be lived again? He didn't want money, he didn't want excuses, he didn't want dramatic headlines. He just wanted to know, what now? How do you rebuild a life that never had the chance to happen? The courtroom was packed. The air was heavy, filled with indignant murmurs, looks of contempt, and a tension that could be cut with a blade. The judge who once held the gavel of justice, who condemned Leonardo without hesitation, now sat in the dock. There was absolute silence as the charges were read. Corruption, obstruction of justice, destruction of evidence. The same man who had once sentenced an innocent man now felt the crushing weight of the truth bearing down on him. His face, once cold and unshakable, now showed traces of despair. He knew there was nowhere else to run, but what most revolted society was not just the corruption of a judge, but the fact that he destroyed a man's life to save someone who never deserved to be saved. His son, the real culprit, had enjoyed his freedom while Leonardo languished behind bars. Years of parties, travel, opportunities, all built on another man's suffering. Now, the weight of the truth caught up with him. His name was printed in newspapers, his face on television, and the public's hatred was overwhelming. But was that enough? Could a sentence, however severe, pay for the life he stole? When the sentence was handed down, a mix of relief and frustration gripped those present. The judge was sentenced to years in prison, but without ever feeling the pain he imposed on Leonardo. His son, finally found guilty of the murder, received the sentence that should have been his from the beginning. But none of this brought real justice, because delayed justice is not justice. The system tried to clean up its image, tried to sell the idea that everything had been resolved, but society has not forgotten. The scandal opened a hole in the credibility of justice, and the question that echoed was terrifying. How many other Leonardos are there out there? How many innocent people are still buried alive by the system, waiting for the truth to one day come to light? Leonardo Martins left prison a free man, but freedom did not erase the scars he carried. What is freedom when the world you knew no longer exists? When the people you loved moved on? When all that was left of you was a name associated with a crime you never committed? He has not recovered his youth, his destroyed dignity, the years of pain and loneliness. The time that was stolen from him would never return. Leonardo's case became a symbol, an open wound in justice, living proof that the system can make mistakes and make bad mistakes. The streets were taken over by protests. Voices echoed demanding change, demanding that never again would another innocent person be thrown into a cell without evidence, without chances, without hope. But the truth is that Leonardo was not the first, and he would not be the last. He was just lucky to see the truth come to light before his life was completely exhausted. But how many were still out there, forgotten, waiting for someone to believe them? He became a man invisible to time. The doors of the world opened, but life had already gone on without him. The compensation money, which came too late, could not buy back the trust, the lost love, the hugs you never gave, the dreams you never realized. He walked the streets, observing the fast pace of the city, seeing children running, couples in love, friends laughing in bars, and he wondered what his life would have been like if on that fateful night the police had done their job. Was justice served? Maybe on paper, but in reality, justice has never been able to return what it destroyed. After losing everything, his freedom, his family, his own identity, Leonardo is finally out of prison. But what now? Has justice been served? Or could it be that the worst sentence was not the sentence he received, but rather the years he can never get back? No money, no apology will bring back the stolen time. What hurts more, being wrongfully convicted or being released too late? Comment, irreparable injustice, if you also believe that certain wounds never heal. What if I told you that this wasn't the worst miscarriage of justice in history? There is an even more absurd case, a truth buried for decades, a twist so unbelievable it challenges everything you think about the system. But that, I'll tell you in the next video. Sign up now, turn on notifications, and follow me in this fight for the truth. The next case will make you even more indignant.